Welcome. Today we're going to be examining a collection of sources that are, well, they're profoundly challenging, but also incredibly important. We're looking at the life, the murder, and the complex legacy of Matthew Wayne Shepard.
Matthew Shepard lived from 1976 to 1998. He was an American university student, and his murder in Laramie, Wyoming really became a lightning rod. I mean, it was more than just a crime. It focused this unprecedented national and international spotlight on LGBTQ rights.
And it exposed a huge gap in hate crime legislation in the United States at the time.
A massive one.
So our mission today is to work through these documents and really pull out the most essential information. We want to go beyond the headlines that everyone remembers and look at Matthew's background, the brutal timeline of the attack itself, and the legal narratives that followed.
And those narratives are key because they shift and often contradict each other, especially when it comes to motive.
Exactly. And then, of course, there's the truly seismic social and legislative movement that was launched in his name.
It's just essential that we approach this with the gravity it deserves. As we go through the details, and you should know some of them are deeply disturbing, we're going to present the facts as neutrally as we can.
But always with the appropriate sympathy for Matthew and for the incredible pain his family has endured.
Absolutely.
Okay. So to really understand the impact of what happened, we have to start with his life. Before his death came to define him, Matthew Shepard was born in Casper, Wyoming on December 1st, 1976.
He was the older of two sons. His parents were Judy and Dennis Shepard, and he had a younger brother, Logan, who was about 4 years younger. The sources suggest they were a very close family.
And his early years seem to have been pretty grounded. He was raised Episcopalian, even served as an altar boy.
Right, which indicates a certain engagement with his community, with ritual. He went through the public school system in Casper Crest Hill, Dean Morgan, and then Natrona County High School for his first 3 years.
The sources mentioned that, he was generally seen as friendly and outgoing, but he did face some teasing, mostly for his small size and because he wasn't really into sports.
Which is a pretty common story, but his life took a really significant turn when his father's work took the family overseas.
That's right. His dad, Dennis, was hired by Saudi Aramco, and the whole family relocated to a residential camp in Dhahran, Saudi Arabia.
But Matthew didn't finish high school there. He moved again, this time to Switzerland, to finish his education at the American School in Switzerland, which is also known as TASIS.
That's a lot of moving around for a teenager. Different countries, different cultures.
Huh.
While he was at TASIS, he took theater courses, studied German and Italian.
But there's a detail from his high school years that is it's critically important to understanding his later life, and it's a deeply traumatic one.
This incident, it happened before he even started college.
That's right. The sources are very clear on this. During a high school trip to Morocco in 1995, Matthew was abducted, beaten, and sexually assaulted.
And this experience just laid the groundwork for some severe mental health challenges that he would battle for the rest of his life.
The effects were immediate and devastating. His mother documented that it triggered deep clinical depression and these paralyzing panic attacks.
And it was severe. I mean, we're talking about suicidal ideation and multiple hospitalizations in the years that followed as he just tried to cope with the aftermath of that assault.
It just paints a picture of a young man carrying this immense, invisible weight, this trauma.
And the sources do suggest a potential link between this pain and some of his other challenges.
Yes. One of his friends expressed concern that the severity of his depression and maybe his attempts to self-medicate or cope might have led him towards some involvement with drugs during his college years.
It's a complex part of his story that's mentioned in some of the accounts of his life, even if it wasn't a central part of the legal proceedings later on.
Right. So after high school, he briefly attended Catawba College in North Carolina and then Casper College back in Wyoming before settling in Denver for a while.
And eventually, he enrolled at the University of Wyoming in Laramie. He chose to major in political science.
And even with everything he was dealing with personally, he was clearly engaged. He was minoring in languages and was even chosen as the student representative for the Wyoming Environmental Council.
The accounts from people who knew him really stand in stark contrast to the violence he would later endure.
They really do.
I keep coming back to his father's description of him. He called Matthew an optimistic and accepting young man who had a special gift of relating to almost everyone. He said he was very approachable and always looked to new challenges.
And beyond that personal charm, there was a real belief system there. His father talked about Matthew's great passion for equality and how he always stood up for the acceptance of people's differences.
That passion for acceptance just makes the hatred that he faced. It makes it all the more tragic.
It does.
Which brings us, very soberly, to the timeline of the crime itself. Let's walk through the events of Tuesday, October 6, 1998. Matthew was 21 years old. He was at a local bar in Laramie called the Fireside Lounge.
And while he was there, he was approached by two local men, Aaron McKinney and Russell Henderson. They were both in their early 20s as well.
According to all the testimony that came out later, they started a conversation with him, and eventually they offered him a ride home.
But that offer was a deception. They didn't take him home. Instead, they drove him to a remote, rural area just east of Laramie, a really desolate and isolated spot.
And what happened there was an act of just extreme, brutal violence.
The documents are very specific. McKinney and Henderson robbed him, they pistol whipped him over and over again, and they tortured him. Then they tied him to a wooden split-rail fence and just left him there to die.
The temperatures that night were near freezing.
They were.
And it's important to pause on a specific detail here, partly to correct something that was widely misreported at the time.
You're talking about the fence.
Exactly. A lot of the early media reports, maybe to sensationalize it even more, they claimed he was tied to a barbed wire fence. But the official court records and all the primary sources confirm it was a wooden split-rail fence.
And the pistol whipping. That's what caused the catastrophic injuries. He had multiple fractures to his skull. The media coverage at the time, pulling from first responder accounts, often focused on one specific heartbreaking detail.
The tears.
Yes. That his face was so badly beaten and covered in blood that the only parts that looked clean were the streaks that had been washed by his tears.
It just speaks volumes about the level of suffering.
Yeah.
And what's really disturbing is the testimony about the perpetrator's state of mind when they did this.
Yeah, the sources are clear that the girlfriends of both McKinney and Henderson later testified that neither of them was under the influence of alcohol or other drugs during the attack.
Which suggests the violence was deliberate, it was conscious, it wasn't fueled by some kind of substance impairment.
After leaving Matthew at the fence, they didn't just disappear, they drove back into Laramie.
And the sources indicate that they had his address and were actually planning to break into his home to steal more things.
So the robbery was intended to be ongoing. But then McKinney got into another fight almost immediately, a separate confrontation with two other young men, Emiliano Morales and Jeremy Herrera.
And that fight resulted in head wounds for Morales and for McKinney himself.
And it's that second, unrelated act of violence that led police straight to them.
Right. Officer Flint Waters responded to that second fight. He arrested Henderson, and then he searched McKinney's truck.
And that search turned up everything. A blood-smeared .357 Magnum pistol, which was the weapon used to beat Matthew. They also found Matthew Shepard's shoes and his credit card right there in the truck.
And they also tried to get their girlfriends, Kristen Price and Chastity Paisley, to give them false alibis.
Right, and help them get rid of the evidence, but that didn't work.
Meanwhile, Matthew was still tied to that fence for about 18 hours.
He was found the next day, still tied up, already in a deep coma. He was found by a cyclist, a man named Aaron Kreifels.
And in just a tragic, unforgettable detail, Kreifels said he initially mistook Matthew's small, broken body on the post for a scarecrow in the distance.
Unimaginable. He was barely breathing when he was found. And that discovery set off this frantic response from law enforcement. And it really highlighted the bravery of the first officer who arrived on the scene, Reggie Flutie.
Her response is, it's rightly documented as heroic.
Mm-hmm.
She found Matthew alive, but just completely covered in blood from the head wounds.
Mm-hmm.
And she realized right away that the medical gloves she'd been issued were faulty.
She had run out of usable pairs.
And knowing his airway was blocked by blood, she just made a split-second decision. She used her bare hands to try and clear his mouth to help him breathe. It was an immediate life-saving act under just incredible duress.
But the tragedy of that situation deepened the next day. Because of the nature of the injuries and all the blood, Officer Flutie was informed that Matthew was HIV positive.
And because she might have had open cuts on her hands, she was now facing her own personal health crisis.
To reduce the risk of contracting the virus, she had to undergo a months-long regimen of AZT, which is an antiretroviral medication. It's used as a post-exposure prophylaxis.
So she had to endure months of anxiety and physical side effects before she finally tested negative for the virus.
And that information about Matthew's HIV status was kept private. It was only disclosed when it was medically necessary for the first responders. Judy Shepard later wrote that she only learned her son was HIV positive after he was already in the hospital fighting for his life.
Just another layer of devastation for the family to process in that moment.
An unbelievable layer.
Matthew was first taken to a hospital in Laramie, but he was very quickly transferred to the trauma center at Poudre Valley Hospital in Fort Collins, Colorado. His injuries were just catastrophic.
He had severe fractures to the back of his head and near his right ear, but the most critical injury was severe brainstem damage. That meant his body had lost its ability to regulate basic functions: heart rate, breathing, body temperature.
The doctors determined that the damage was too widespread to even attempt surgery. He was put on full life support. He never regained consciousness.
And during those 6 days he was in the hospital, the story went global. There were candlelight vigils being held in cities all over the world, with everyone fearing the worst.
Matthew Shepard died from his injuries on October 12, 1998, at 12:53 in the morning. He was 21 years old.
The sheer horror of the attack meant that the legal proceedings were immediately under this intense media glare, and from the very beginning, the central question wasn't who did it. They were caught so quickly.
It was why.
Exactly. That question of motive drove everything that followed. McKinney and Henderson were arrested and first charged with attempted murder, kidnapping, and aggravated robbery.
But after Matthew's death, that attempted murder charge was upgraded to first-degree murder, which made them both eligible for the death penalty.
And in the pretrial phase, back in November of '98, the prosecution immediately introduced the narrative of anti-gay bias. They wanted the judge and the public to know that sexual orientation was a part of this crime, even if robbery was also a motive.
A key piece of testimony came from Sergeant Rob Debris. He detailed an interview he'd had with McKinney.
Right, and McKinney claimed that he and Henderson had lured Matthew into the truck by pretending to be gay specifically so they could rob him. Then McKinney claimed the violence only started when Matthew put a hand on his knee.
So he was suggesting a kind of panic reaction.
Exactly, a defensive reaction. But that story was immediately contradicted by other statements the court heard.
Detective Ben Fritzen testified about what McKinney's girlfriend, Kristen Price, had told him.
And she claimed that McKinney told her the violence was triggered by how McKinney felt about gays, which strongly suggested that anti-gay animus was the real underlying motive for the brutality.
So you have these two conflicting narratives from day one.
From the very beginning. Then, in April of 1999, Russell Henderson decided to take a plea deal to avoid the death penalty.
He pleaded guilty to murder and kidnapping and received 2 consecutive life sentences. But even then, at his sentencing, his lawyer tried to steer the narrative away from hate, arguing that Matthew was not targeted because he was gay.
So the real focus then became Aaron McKinney's trial, which started in October 1999. And his defense team built their strategy around what's known in legal circles as the gay panic defense.
Can we just pause there for a second? For anyone who might not know, what exactly is the gay panic defense?
It's a legal strategy, historically, where a defendant argues that the victim's sexual orientation or a perceived sexual advance was so shocking or upsetting that it caused them to enter a state of temporary insanity.
So they lose control and commit assault or murder?
Exactly. It basically tries to use homophobia as a mitigating factor to get a murder charge reduced to something like manslaughter.
Did it work in this case?
No. The judge completely rejected the use of the gay panic defense. But even without it, McKinney's lawyers argued that their only intent was robbery, not murder. They claimed the violence just escalated out of control.
So no premeditated intent to kill.
That was their argument. But the prosecutor, Cal Rarucha, he argued the opposite. He said the killing was premeditated and that it was driven by greed and violence. He was careful to frame it as both a vicious, intentional murder and one motivated by bias.
And the jury came back with a somewhat complex verdict.
They did. McKinney was found guilty of felony murder, but he was found not guilty of the charge of premeditated murder.
Okay, so that distinction, felony murder, is really important. What does that mean legally?
The felony murder rule basically says that if a death occurs while you're committing another dangerous felony, in this case, the robbery and the kidnapping, you can be convicted of murder, even if you didn't specifically intend for that person to die.
So the killing happened during the felony, and that's enough.
Exactly. It made proving premeditation less critical for securing a murder conviction.
So with that conviction, the trial moved into the penalty phase, where the jury had to decide if McKinney would get the death penalty. And this is where Matthew's parents, Judy and Dennis Shepard, did something extraordinary.
As the jury was starting to deliberate on capital punishment, the Shepards made a deal with the prosecution.
They agreed to take the death penalty off the table. In exchange, McKinney would receive 2 consecutive life terms with absolutely no possibility of parole.
It was an act of profound mercy coming from a family that was experiencing this unimaginable grief.
Jenna Shepard's words at the time were so powerful. He said they were showing mercy to someone who refused to show any mercy.
It was just a stunning moment. It shifted the entire narrative away from vengeance and toward this message of compassion, while still ensuring the perpetrator received the maximum possible sentence.
But even with the trial over, that central question of motive, it just never really went away.
Yeah.
The idea that this was purely a hate crime was challenged years later in the media.
It really was. This challenge gained a lot of traction in 2004, 6 years after the murder, with a report on the ABC News show 2020.
And the main point of this new narrative was explosive. It suggested the murder was not motivated by Matthew's sexuality, but was primarily a drug-related robbery that just turned violent.
And they had a major retraction to back it up. Kristen Price, McKinney's ex-girlfriend, who had originally testified that the violence was about McKinney's anti-gay feelings, completely reversed her story.
She said on camera, "I don't think it was a hate crime at all," and claimed that she had lied to the police in her first statement.
And even the original prosecutor, Cal Rarucha, was quoted in a way that gave some credibility to this new version. He said it was a murder that was once again driven by drugs.
So for the public, this created a huge contradiction. You have the official trial narrative, and then you have these later statements from people who were so close to the perpetrators.
The reaction from LGBTQ advocacy groups was immediate, and it was furious. GLA heavily criticized the 2020 report. They argued it was relying on the changing stories of completely unreliable people, a convicted murderer and an accessory who'd already admitted to lying to the police.
Judy Shepard's lawyer called it a massive oversimplification.
And Michael Adams from Lambda Legal, he had the most memorable description of it. He called it an attempt to de-gay the murder. He was implying a deliberate effort to strip the element of anti-gay bias from the story.
And this push to redefine the motive didn't stop there. It got even more intense with the publication of a book in 2013 by Stephen Jimenez.
Right, the book was called The Book of Matt, and Jimenez had actually been the producer on that controversial 2020 segment.
Yeah, his book went even further. It introduced the really inflammatory claim that Matthew Shepard and Aaron McKinney had actually been occasional sexual partners.
Which would suggest the attack wasn't a random act of homophobic violence, but maybe stemmed from some kind of personal conflict over sex or drugs. Jimenez even cited a detective who allegedly said Matthew's sexual orientation certainly wasn't the motive.
So how was this book received? Because it created a fierce debate.
A very fierce one. Critics called it sensational and irresponsible, a form of victim blaming, but others defended it, and the division went right into law enforcement itself. Some of the original investigators criticized Jimenez's conclusions, while others maintained that drugs and greed were, in fact, major factors.
So what this leaves you with, as someone trying to understand this, is a really fragmented record. The sources present at least 3 competing motives: pure anti-gay hatred, a robbery gone wrong fueled by greed, or a fatal argument between acquaintances involved in drugs.
Or some combination of all 3. And what's clear is that the facts of the motive were almost immediately politicized. The power of the murder to spark legislative change became, in some ways, more important than finding a single definitive motive that everyone could agree on.
That ambiguity is now a permanent part of his legacy.
It is. And regardless of the truth about the motive, the social and political impact was immediate and transformative. The news of the murder was met with global grief, but also with these severe anti-gay protests that, in a way, demonstrated the very hatred the crime had come to symbolize.
The most notorious of these protesters were members of the Westboro Baptist Church, led by Fred Phelps.
They picketed Matthew's funeral, they picketed the trials, holding these just shocking signs: Matt in hell, God hates fags.
And you just have to imagine the emotional toll on Judy and Dennis Shepard. They're trying to navigate their son's death, the trial, and they have to sit in the courthouse and hear these protesters shouting vile things at them.
It was in direct response to that targeted hate that one of the most powerful and lasting images of this whole tragedy was created.
Angel action.
Angel action.
Wow.
It was organized by Matthew's friend, Romaine Patterson. It was an impromptu counter-protest.
And it was such a simple, beautiful idea. Members of the group wore white robes and these gigantic angel wings. They stood in a circle around the Westboro protesters.
And formed this massive, silent human barrier that physically blocked the hateful signs from the view of the family and the media. It was an act of protective solidarity that just captured the public's imagination.
And that same spirit of activism led directly to the formation of the Matthew Shepard Foundation.
Dennis and Judy Shepard started it in December of 1998, right after their son's death, and it has since become this powerful force for LGBTQ rights advocacy, especially for supporting gay youth.
But this also brought up a really interesting and challenging point about how we turn victims into symbols.
Right. The activist John Stoltenberg raised this provocative question. He argued that by portraying Matthew solely as a gay-bashing victim, we might actually be presenting an incomplete story.
His argument was that we shouldn't ignore the full tragedy of Matthew's life, the earlier trauma of the rape, the depression, the hospitalization, the potential drug use, just to create a simpler, more politically useful narrative.
He argued that ignoring that complexity will do nothing to help other young men in our community who were sold for sex, ravaged by drugs, and generally exploited. It's a call for a more holistic kind of support, not just legislative action.
But his death absolutely exposed a huge political vacuum. At the time, there was no federal law and no Wyoming state law that recognized crimes based on sexual orientation as hate crimes.
There was no legal mechanism to add weight to the sentencing because of the anti-gay bias.
And Matthew's friends, they saw this gap immediately. Within hours of him being found, they were already contacting the media and officials. The goal was to make sure that the fact that Matthew is gay did not go unnoticed.
One friend recalled that they wanted to make Matt a poster child for their cause. It was an immediate, calculated decision to link the crime directly to the lack of a hate crimes law in Wyoming.
That public pressure led to a bill being introduced in the Wyoming legislature.
And that's where you see the sharp political division in the state. The bill failed on a perfect 30-30 tie vote.
So with state efforts completely stalled, the focus had to shift to the federal level. And that struggle would last for more than a decade.
Even before Matthew's murder, President Clinton had been trying to expand federal hate crime laws. A bill was first introduced back in 1997.
But Matthew's murder gave that legislation a new urgency and a face. A version of the act actually passed both the House and the Senate in 2000.
But it was stripped out in a conference committee, a political maneuver that just killed it. So it never even reached the president's desk.
The fight just went on and on. In 2007, the legislation was finally named the Matthew Shepard and James Byrd Jr. Hate Crimes Prevention Act.
Linking Matthew's case with the horrific murder of James Byrd Jr., a black man who was dragged to his death in Texas that same year, 1998. It was a way to show the bill's reach across different protected groups.
But the bill ran into a huge political wall in the executive branch.
President George W. Bush indicated that he would veto the legislation if it came to his desk, and that threat was enough to kill it again in that session.
The election of Barack Obama was the turning point. He committed to finally passing the act. But the debate leading up to it in 2009 was still incredibly intense.
There was that moment when a congresswoman from North Carolina, Virginia Foxx, called the hate crime label on Shepard's murder a hoax.
She faced immediate, massive backlash and had to retract her comments, calling them a poor choice of words.
But despite that opposition, the momentum was finally there. The House passed it, 249 to 175, in April of 2009.
The Senate then cleverly attached it as an amendment to the National Defense Authorization Act, which made it very difficult for opponents to vote against.
And it finally passed the Senate in October 2009 with a vote of 68-29.
This legislative journey, more than 10 years after his death, finally ended when President Barack Obama signed the bill into law on October 28, 2009.
And after that monumental legislative win, Matthew's life was given a final physical resting place. In October of 2018, 20 years after he was killed, his ashes were interred in the crypt of the Washington National Cathedral.
The ceremony itself was just filled with historical significance. It was presided over by the Right Reverend Gene Robinson, the first openly gay Episcopal bishop.
And the Washington National Cathedral, this is a site of immense national importance. Matthew Shepard's interment was the first of a national figure at the cathedral since Helen Keller 50 years earlier.
It really cemented his place in American history as a figure of social change.
And beyond the laws and memorials, his story has just deeply permeated American culture. The sources list so many artistic responses, but the most notable is probably the Laramie Project.
The play, right. It used interviews and documents from the people of Laramie to build this narrative around the tragedy.
His mother's memoir, The Meaning of Matthew, is another key document. And then there was music. Melissa Etheridge wrote the song Scarecrow, which is a reference to how he was found.
And his legacy even reached professional sports. The NBA player Jason Collins wore the jersey number 98 for the year Matthew died.
And Collins later came out as gay, and when he did, his number 98 jersey became a top seller. It was a really powerful symbol of advocacy and visibility.
So as we look back on all of this, the personal tragedy, the decade-long legislative fight, the contradictory evidence about motive, we're forced to accept that his legacy is just defined by its complexity.
It brings us back to that challenge from activists like John Stoltenberg. When a victim becomes a symbol for a cause, do we end up simplifying their life story? He argued that ignoring Matthew's full struggles, the trauma, the depression, the potential drug use, was a disservice.
That perspective really urges us not just to celebrate the legislative victory, but to use the full, complicated tragedy of his life to better understand and help other vulnerable young people who are facing similar things.
The focus, he argued, should be on holistic community support, not just on punitive laws.
Ultimately, what the sources show is that a single, terrible event, even one where the core motive is still debated by the people who investigated it, can mobilize massive legislative and social change. Matthew Shepard's murder, regardless of the granular details, undeniably exposed the deep flaws in America's response to hate and profoundly reshaped the nation's legal landscape.
Thanks for listening.